You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Amazon's got everything you need for your dorm, from everyday essentials and school supplies to clothes and decor to bedding for power naps. And regular naps, too. Save on all things college at Amazon.
The history podcast that is not your history class, with me, your proud host, Katie Charlwood, current isolationist and reader of books. So, I know what you're thinking, isolationist, that's a weird way to start the show. Well, I am currently in isolation because, dun 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 dun, I was flagged as a close contact for someone who tested positive for COVID. I'm like, shit. So there I am. 2 masks, my glasses, and a visor. So it's my entire face is definitely, covered. I've got gloves, the whole shebang. We go through the drive-through, I get tested, I feel like I'm drowning, but it's all good, it's all for the greater good. And they tell me that regardless of my first test result, I have to isolate for 10 days. And I'm like, fuck. Not only is this one of the busier times of the year where I work, but also it is a bank holiday. And it is my daughter's 5th birthday. So, first test comes back negative, but I still have to act like I'm isolating. So I got to see my daughter on her birthday, because I'm in a separate house right now. And it just kind of sucks because I couldn't hug my daughter on her birthday. I couldn't, do cuddle time with the kids or snuggle on the couch and watch a movie and, just the basic normal stuff that you want to do with your kids, But luckily, my first test was negative, so I gotta get retested. If the second test comes up negative, then yay, I can go back to work. But for the next week, I am isolating, which is pain in the arse. But if having to stay away from other people is the worst part of this scenario for me, then I think I'm getting off pretty fucking lightly, And so, to the topic of today's story, and it's Pride Month, and in fairness, I really shouldn't need a reason to pick a queer person to talk about. I think we should be telling stories of LGBTQ plus people all year round, because, we really need to be more inclusive about a bunch of stuff, to be honest. I really shouldn't need an excuse to talk about a queer person. But it is Pride Month, and so I decided for the rest of the month we're going to talk about LGBTQ plus people and events and other stuff because I want to, because it's my podcast and I'll say what I want to. Oh, and the subject of today's story was actually requested by somebody on my TikTok, and honestly it was such a good choice. So we are talking about today the life of Julie Dombigné, also known as Mademoiselle Maupin, the bisexual badass who honestly, I think I could do a 3-part series about her on TikTok. She's just so amazing. But I know what you're thinking. Quit your jibber jabber and fact you, and let's get our source on, okay? So we have The Real Life of Julie Daubigné by Kelly Gardner, Julie Daubigné, or One of the Coolest Gals in History by C.J. Evans. And then, of course, we have theculturetrip.com, encyclopedia.com, and thereg.com. So we're going to start at the beginning. And lest we forget, women of the past, no matter how erudite and exciting they are, a lot of the times their early life we don't have a lot of information on. And this is also the case with Julie Daubigné. So, which I've probably pronounced wrong, and I look forward to being consistently reminded. So the origins of Julie are... Julie Daubigné entered the world somewhere between 1670 and 1673. Most sources usually use 1673, but there is a discrepancy there because women in the past. Her father, Gaston Daubigné, of course it's a Gaston, he was a secretary to Louis de Léronguis, Comte d'Armagnac, the master of the horse for King Louis XIV. Like I said, not a lot is known about Julie when she's wee. But, so Gaston, her father, he would train the court pages in preparation for their life at court. So while he was training the pages, the boys, he would also train his daughter Probably because, he thought, why am I going to train someone else to teach her when I can teach her myself? Probably. So these pages, they would learn reading, drawing, literature, and of course, fencing. Now this is going to come in handy for Julie a wee bit in the future, but we'll get to that. Oh, and also, small possibility she was also dressing in boys' clothing, but it's very much a perhaps. And if you're training someone to duel, it was probably handier having her dressed in proper attire. You know what I mean? By the time she's 14, she ends up in this affair with her dad's boss. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and just assume that she didn't have that much say in the matter. The Count d'Armagnac, who, that's the thing. Generally, any member of the aristocracy would have a mistress. It was very common at the time. It was very normal. And it was probably at the point where it was actually expected. So it wasn't surprising that he had a mistress. Especially a mistress who was, still a fucking child. But, we're not going to get into that. It was the past. Just because they did things differently doesn't mean I can't be disgusted with it. And so in general, we think that in order to preserve the reputation of the young Julie, which we think was probably requested, which is presumed to be, urged by her father, the Count arranges for young Julie to marry Sieur de Maupin of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. And pretty sharpish after the wedding, actually. Pretty sharpish. Her new husband, he magically receives an administrative position in the south of France. But she stays in Paris with, I was going to say her mister, but that's incorrect. Wait a minute. If she is the mistress, she is his mistress, the Count's mistress, what is the opposite term? What's the term? If she is the mistress, what is the Count? Or what is the Count to her? What? Anyhow, she marries the Sieur de Maupin, and the very next day, the day after the wedding, he just manages to get this administrative position, and he is sent to Toulouse in the south of France. So he's working away in Toulouse. Madame Maupin, she's actually staying behind in Paris with the Count. So, actually, now that she's married, her name is Julie Emilie de Maupin. I'm probably butchering her name like fuck now, actually. But anyway, and there are reports of her going by the name Julia or Emily, but we're just gonna stick with Julie, I think, just to keep us doing well. Julie was, kicking it about in Paris. And if Julie was any normal member of the aristocracy, generally, this would be sort of the area where the story ends. Has an arranged marriage, continues mistressing. I feel it just feels wrong. Because the opposite of mistress is master. But mistress sounds more submissive. I'm sorry, I know I'm sticking on it, but it's just feeling wrong. So, young Julie, so around about 1687, Madame de Maupin is growing a little tired of the Count, or he's grown tired with her. Either way, she becomes involved with the assistant fencing matter, Serran. So unfortunately, there's this teeny tiny incident where Serran kills a man in an illegal duel, and the Lieutenant General of Police, Gabriel Nicolas de Rene, tries to arrest Serran for, killing a man in an illegal duel, but, these two lovebirds, they're like, I don't think I'm gonna do this. And instead of letting Serran be apprehended by the cops, the army, instead of letting Serran be apprehended by the authorities, the two of them decide to up ship and fuck off. So they flee Paris, they get the hell out of Dodge, and off they flee to Marseille. So as they're journeying south, obviously they need to have income, and surprisingly they actually do this through legitimate means. They're giving fencing competitions, they're singing, they're doing shows, they're in taverns, they're at local fairs, and reportedly, as they're doing this, Julie was dressed in male clothing. This is generally where we get the records of her cross-dressing, which in fairness probably makes more sense. If you're travelling that distances, it was probably easier to wear male clothing than it was female a lot of the time. So it seems very much that it was either a bit, haha, I'm in men's clothing, hear me sing, or it was just like a more convenient option, you know? Because the whole thing about her dressing in men's clothing is she doesn't hide the fact that she's a woman. She's billed as a woman. She makes no attempt to hide the fact that she's a woman. So at one point, during a duelling competition, she starts getting heckled. And this dude is like, women couldn't possibly duel as well as that. I'm paraphrasing. And she's like, I'll show you a titty croissant. And she opens her blouse, which, surprise, surprise, stuns the man into silence. So when they eventually arrive in Marseille, she joins this opera company run by Pierre Gautier. And she's not singing under like Madame de Maupin at this point. She's still singing under her maiden name, Julie d'Aubigné. By all accounts, Julie is this fantastic opera singer. However, she couldn't read music, but that's not that uncommon even now. Even though she couldn't read music, she had such a fantastic memory that it didn't really cause her too many problems. And add into that, you know, she's a really good actress, she's talented, she's fucking beautiful. She becomes the it girl in Marseille. She's doing really well. So at some point, the love affair with Selene, it just fizzles out. And Julie falls in love with another woman. You know, which, shocking for the time. But what is more shocking is the fact that neither of the women had this relationship from the woman's parents. And they were like, oh no, fuck this for a game of soldiers. They take the woman and they send her away to a nunnery. That's right. They put her in the Visitandine convent in Avignon, thinking, haha, they say, for her protection. Julie's like, okay, completely undeterred by the fact that her girlfriend's been chucked in a nunnery. Being the badass bisexual dueling diva we know and love, she follows her girlfriend to the convent in Avignon, takes holy vows, disguises herself as a postulant, and enters the nunnery in disguise. And when she gets in there, she finds her best girl and they plot their escape. And then in a crazy random happenstance, the ladies seize an opportunity when an elderly nun passes away. So, you know, they do the old, you know, the bait and switch. They take the nun corpse and they put it in the bed of her girlfriend. And you think, fair enough, that'll buy you some time. But oh no! She has to take it one fucking step further, doesn't she? Just to add an extra layer. Julie wants to add a little bit of spice. And after they place the nun corpse in the bed, Julie sets the building on fire. And then the two flee. And the two of them escape the town. Like, she breaks into a nunnery, does a body swap, sets it on fire, and steals back her girl. So after this grandest of grand gestures, about 3 months in, the relationship ends and this young lady returns to her family. She goes back. And Julie is charged. And even though she's not there, a court charges her in absentia, basically. And they try her as a male. And probably because of like a mashup of two things. The first being that it would have shamed the family. Like a known lesbian affair would have shamed, you know, the women in her family. And also, and the patriarchy, I mean, especially back then, had trouble thinking that a woman could do anything, especially something like this. So, Julie is charged with kidnapping, body snatching, arson, and failing to appear before the tribunal. And she is sentenced to death, and that death is death by fire.
Being a part of a royal family might seem enticing, but more often than not, it comes at the expense of everything else, like your freedom, your privacy, and sometimes even your head. Wondery's new podcast, Even the Royals, pulls back the curtain on royal families, past and present, from all over the world, to show you the darker side of what it means to be royalty. From icons like Grace Kelly, Oscar-winning actress turned Princess of Monaco, who the world saw as the ultimate good girl. She mastered playing a happy wife and mother, but beneath it all, she was desperately lonely. Grace spent her whole life working towards perfection, and it ultimately cost her her happiness. Or King Ludwig II from Bavaria. He was only 18 when his father died, leaving the crown to him and a duty to rule that he never wanted. He refused to lead, and used the funds from the royal treasury to further his extreme love of opera. But this choice eventually cost him the crown and his life. Follow Even the Royals on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge Even the Royals ad-free right now on Wondery Plus.
And Julie's gone back to her life of singing and dueling and wandering about, working her way back to Paris. And she ends up dueling with a young man, stabbing him through the shoulder with her sword and, kicking his ass. She decides to be the bigger person and helps him with his boo-boo, nurses him back to health, and they become good friends. Possibly lovers. Do we know? No. Do we care? No, we fucking do not. So, she is heading back to Paris. She's got her vision board up. She is setting her sights on the Paris Opera, and she's like retraining and stuff, so she's refining her craft. So near Poitiers, she meets this old actor called Maréchal to help train her. Unfortunately, that doesn't end well because he's a raging alcoholic and it just takes over his entire life. And Julie does the completely sane and reasonable thing and gets the fuck out of there. So she leaves and takes the opera singer Gabriel Vincent de Venard as a lover. So when she reaches Paris, she finds out there's a warrant out for her, death. So because this death warrant is still out in her head, she goes back to Comte d'Armagnac, who somehow she convinced him to talk to the king. The Count talks to the king. He petitions King Louis XIV for Julie to be fully pardoned. And Louis apparently found the tales of all her exploits fucking hilarious, and he's like, this is good, yeah, absolutely, boom, done, you're fine. So Julie gets accepted into the Paris Opera. Although initially she was rejected, she gets hired in 1690. I mean, she was talented, we know she was talented, but, she used everything she could at her disposal. She befriends this elderly singer Bevard and, Thévenard, her lover. They convince Jean-Nicolas de Francine, master of the king's household, to accept her into the company. And while she's at the Paris Opera, she plays a bunch of roles. She's performing regularly. She's in Pallas Athena, Cadmus et Hermione. She starts off singing as a soprano, but then she moves back to her normal contralto range. I'll be honest with you, I don't know what a contralto is. I'm assuming it's a little bit lower than soprano. Oh, is that what everybody calls an alto? Because that's like a little bit lower. Not that I'm an alto, I have no range or power. So when she's performing in Paris, she does so under the name Madame de Maupin, because, that's technically her name. And also, let's face it, one, we do love a bit of alliteration, and two, all performers in the opera, like all of the ladies who performed in the opera, they would be known as Madame. They would always be referred to as Madame, not Mademoiselle. So while she's in the opera, she takes a bunch of lovers, male, female, whatever tickled her fancy. And so audiences loved her, but like a lot of actors and actresses and a lot of the other players, their relationship was somewhat, fractious, tempestuous, Louis Galland de Mesnay, he was, by all accounts, a lecherous piece of shit, and he was constantly pestering women members of the troupe. And he also called Julie some kind of slur. I'm not entirely sure which slur it was, but he was calling her something. So after he's been a total and utter creep to her, and she's like, no thank you, she ends up challenging him to a duel, and the other actors have to intervene and, diffuse the whole situation. But later that night, Julie waits outside the theatre and beats the shit out of him with her cane, steals his watch and steals his snuff box. And the very next day, he comes in and he's like, oh no, I was mugged. I was mugged by all of these men, these strong men who took me on, so many men. And Julie's like, no. And she presents all of her trophies from her previous night's endeavours, and he is literally laughed off of the stage. And this is something she continues to do in the future, because she take trinkets, trophies, because men would often refuse to admit that they had been beaten in a fencing duel by her. Oh, and Julie apparently falls in love with Fanchon Moreau, who is a singer but also the mistress of the Grand Dauphin, and is rejected by Moreau. And when she's rejected by Moreau, she tries to end her own life. And thankfully she doesn't succeed. So in 1695, Julie attends this ball hosted by Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, who's King Louis XIV's brother. And she arrives dressed as a man, and she kisses a young woman on the dance floor. And immediately upon kissing this woman, Julie is challenged to a duel by 3 men. And naturally, being fucking Julie d'Aubigné, she accepts. The woman who fears no man, apparently. She's like, fuck it, yeah, I'll take you on. She goes all D'Artagnan on them and decides to take on all 3. Wait a minute. I wonder if that was inspired by... No. 3 Musketeers fight couldn't have been... Under the moonlight, Julie takes on all 3 men by the Seine River. Not sure if she wounded or killed them all. That bit's kind of fuzzy. And as we know from before with Seine, the honour duelling thing was just like not a thing anymore. It was very much fucking illegal. And depending on the circumstances, you could be sentenced to death, because an honour duelling was basically seen as a challenge to royal authority, and everything was supposed to be settled by the king's laws, not stabby. So she has to flee Paris again. So she buggers off to Brussels and becomes the lover Maximilian Emmanuel, the Elector of Bavaria. And she's apparently just too much for him to handle, and he offers her 40,000 francs to just leave. And she is pissed off at this, and honestly, I think I too would be this petty. She threw the money directly back at his crotch and was like, fuck this, fuck that, fuck you, fuck off. And off she does fuck to Madrid. So she goes to work, and she ends up working as a lady's maid to the Countess Marino. And the two of them absolutely despise each other, and she, ends up returning back to France. And the king pardons her a second fucking time because the dueling laws only applied to men. So the misogyny worked in her favour again. And so, she's had 2 pardons, she's travelled Europe, she's stabbed a lot of men, and she's like, maybe I'll try settle down. Also, in addition, furthermore, she even reunites with her husband, Sieur de Maupin, from way back. They're still married. She's like, hey, let's reconcile. But she, personally, within herself, has not settled down. So she is fighting with other actors. She threatens to shoot a duchess, attacks her landlord, bites, her old lover Donegal hard enough that he's actually bleeding on stage, and she even stabs herself with a real dagger during a stage performance. She goes full method, total Johnny Depp. And then finally, Julie finds someone who makes her feel probably as close to content as she can be. She falls in love with Madame de Maupin de Florensac, who was known as the most beautiful woman in France. And according to the accounts of the time, they lived together in perfect harmony, and their relationship lasted much, much longer than most of her other relationships, in fairness. And they were together for 2 years until Florensac, she dies from a fever. And out of everything that has happened to Julie d'Aubigné throughout her life, this is the thing that breaks her. So she is inconsolable, and she retires from the opera in 1705, and in a crazy random happenstance, she takes refuge in a convent in Provence, and there she remains for 2 years when she dies at the age of 33. Shit, that's how old I am. What the fuck? And 33 is pretty young to pass, especially when you're in a convent. And we don't know what her cause of death was, or where she's buried. There is no known grave for her. And it seems like for quite a lot of history tried to forget her. And that is the story of Julie d'Aubigné, the opera-singing, bisexual, badass duelist. So, what did we learn today? We learned that gender non-conformity isn't new. That it's always good to have a talent you can fall back on, or other people can fall back onto. Grand gestures like stealing a woman from a convent is only a romantic gesture if you have equal levels of affection and commitment and things like that. If you liked this story, and or my retelling of the story, please absolutely go on to Apple Podcasts and rate and review 5 stars and say something about bisexual badasses, sword fights, dueling. Oh man, Jesus. As always, I want to thank everybody for their podcast reviews. You have no idea. It means so much to me. It means so much. It's so amazing, and thank you so very, very much. And also, don't forget you can follow me on social media. I'm on TikTok, Instagram and Facebook with Who Did What Now Pod, and on Twitter with Who Did What Now PD. And it is that time of the show again. It is shout out time. I just want to say a big thank you for been supporting the show and have been just so fucking amazing. So I want to say a big thank you to Rachel from Cornwall. Welcome to the Guild of Historical Descent. You're awesome. And I also want to say a big thank you again to the amazing Haley from Niagara Falls. The links are all in the show notes, but I always feel strange talking about Patreon because it feels strange asking for support to create content, even though I need the support to create content. And if you want me to thank you at the end of a show, yeah, absolutely. Just jump onto Patreon, the links are in the show notes, and yeah. And now, before we go, it's time for recommendations. I've been reading a book by Ben Hubbard, which is all about poison. That's and it's just for research purposes, absolutely. For history stuff, I'm not planning to poison anybody. It's for research, I promise. And for my enemies, she says on the podcast. I watched Bo Burnham's Inside, and frankly, I mean, it's comedy, but it's comedy in the way that a mental breakdown is funny, which is not usually funny unless you've had one. Which I think as well, when you're watching it, is that you need to be really aware that everything we see is curated. It's curated and created specifically for us to view. And I think we need to take that into consideration when sort of absorbing this content. And and listening. Yeah, I'm back to small town murder. Those boys help me sleep. Probably really, really weird, but they help me sleep. But anyway, I'm gonna say goodbye and bid you adieu and adios, au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, my friends. Bye-bye.